Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. I never really thought much about the national park where I worked. Just another place to spend my days, I guess. You could say I was always a bit of a loner, happy to wander the trails and keep an eye on the wildlife. My name's Roy Larson, and I've been with the United States Forest Service for nearly a decade now. I'm not one to talk much about myself, but let's just say life hasn't always been kind. Divorce, a couple of kids who hardly know me, and a job that keeps me away from everything I once held dear. The mountains of Colorado were a second home to me. The Rockies offered solace, a place to disappear into when life's noise became too loud. It was a quiet morning when I got the call. A hiker named Dean Redding had gone missing near the Comanche Peak Wilderness. His wife Linda was frantic, saying he hadn't returned from a solo hike he'd planned 2 days ago. Normally, solo hikers know the risks and come prepared, but sometimes things go wrong. I grabbed my gear, including the essentials: radio, first aid kit, a couple of protein bars, and my Glock 22. We weren't always armed, but after an incident with a bear a few years back, I made it a habit. My colleague, Gary Finch, joined me in the truck. Gary was a big guy, all muscle and no nonsense, with a knack for tracking. We'd worked together for years, and there was an unspoken trust between us. We drove to the trailhead where Linda was waiting, her eyes red and swollen. She clutched a photograph of Dean. "Please find him," she whispered as we set off. The trail was steep and winding, dotted with pines and boulders. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. We moved quickly, Gary checking for tracks while I scouted ahead. About an hour in, we found the first sign of trouble, a discarded backpack near a ravine. It was Dean's. We radioed back to base, letting them know what we'd found. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that danced as the wind rustled through the trees. It was Gary who first saw the blood. Not much, just a few drops leading off the trail. We followed the trail cautiously, the tension thick between us. Suddenly there was a rustling in the underbrush, and we froze. A deer bolted out, disappearing into the forest. Gary cursed under his breath, and we continued. About a mile further, the trail of blood ended at a small clearing. The scene before us was horrific. Dean's body lay there, torn apart as if savaged by some wild animal. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. His face was frozen in a final expression of terror. I've seen death before, but this was different, brutal and senseless. We radioed in the Discovery, detailing the gruesome find. As we secured the area, I noticed something odd about the wounds. They were too clean, almost surgical. Gary and I exchanged a look, both of us thinking the same thing. This wasn't the work of a bear or any wild animal we knew. As we waited for the coroner, we searched the area for clues. That's when we found the tracks large, almost like a bear's, but different. They had an odd shape, with what looked like claw marks. I felt a chill creep up my spine. We followed the tracks deeper into the forest, the underbrush growing denser. After another hour, we came across a cave. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, The tracks led straight in. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Gary asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I replied, tightening my grip on the Glock. Whatever did this might still be in there. We radioed our position and our intention to enter the cave. Backup was on the way, but we couldn't wait. If there was any chance of finding out what happened to Dean, we had to take it. The cave was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and something else, something metallic and decayed. As we moved deeper, the walls seemed to close in around us. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing old bones scattered across the floor. "Human bones," Gary muttered, a curse escaping his lips. I could feel the tension ratcheting up. Then we heard it, a low, guttural noise that seemed to reverberate through the cave. We moved slowly, the sound growing louder. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. We rounded a corner and came face to face with the source of the noise. It was a creature, hunched and grotesque, with matted fur and a twisted, animalistic form. Its eyes glowed with a predatory intensity. Gary and I didn't hesitate. We opened fire, the gunshots echoing off the cave walls. The creature let out a horrifying screech and lunged at us. Gary was fast, sidestepping and firing again. I aimed for its head, but it was quick, too quick. It swiped at Gary, catching him on the arm. He cried out in pain but kept firing. Finally, a bullet found its mark, and the creature collapsed with a final, agonizing cry. We stood there, panting, staring at the lifeless body. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen, a nightmarish blend of human and beast. We backed out of the cave, dragging Gary's wounded arm. Outside, we radioed for immediate medical assistance and detailed what had happened. The response was skeptical at first, until we described the bones and the creature. The following hours were a blur of activity. The area was cordoned off, and more personnel arrived to secure the scene. Gary was taken to the hospital, his arm heavily bandaged. I stayed behind to assist with the investigation. The creature's body was transported for analysis, but I had a feeling we wouldn't get many answers. As the day wore on, Linda arrived at the scene, escorted by officers. Her face crumpled when she saw Dean's body, and I could only offer a few comforting words. The analysis of the creature's body revealed a bizarre mix of human and animal DNA, something that shouldn't exist. It raised more questions than answers. Who, or what, had created this abomination, and why? The official report would be classified, buried deep in government files, never to be spoken of again. Days later, I sat in my office, staring at the same paperwork, but my mind was elsewhere. The encounter haunted me, not because of fear, but because of the unknown. What else was out there, lurking in the remote corners of the wilderness? I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only scratched the surface of something much larger and more terrifying. As I filed away the last of the reports, I knew that life would go on. There would be more missing hikers, more searches, and possibly more discoveries. But this time, I would be prepared for whatever came next. I glanced at the clock and packed up my things, ready to head home. I drove away from the station, the weight of the day's events pressing down on me. The mountains loomed in the distance, their secrets hidden in the shadows. And as I left the forest behind, I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lay waiting to be discovered. The investigation continued for months, but nothing definitive came of it. Dean's death was attributed to a wild animal attack, and the creature's existence was never officially acknowledged. It was easier that way, to let the public believe in the ordinary dangers of the wilderness. Gary eventually returned to work, his arm scarred but functional. We never spoke much about that day, an unspoken agreement to let it lie. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but I kept my Glock closer, my eyes sharper. In the end, we were just men doing our jobs, facing the unknown with a mix of courage and fear. The wilderness held many secrets, and it wasn't our place to uncover them all. We were there to protect, to search, and to rescue. And sometimes that meant facing the darkness head on, with no guarantee of what we might find. My name is Elias Yazzie, and this happened to me back in 1998. I was living in a small town called Pineal, nestled in the rugged terrain of eastern Arizona. It wasn't much, just a few thousand people, mostly folks who'd grown up there or, like me, had a deep connection to the land. I'm Navajo, and my family has been here for generations. I worked as a mechanic, fixing up cars and trucks for people around town. Life was simple and predictable until that summer. It started on a Friday evening. My friend Dakota had convinced me to go camping with him and his younger brother Micah. I wasn't too keen on it at first. I'd had a long week and just wanted to relax, but Dakota was persistent, and eventually I caved. We packed up our gear and drove out to an area known as the Blue Range Primitive Area, a remote part of the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. We set up camp near a creek, the sound of water trickling over rocks providing a soothing background noise. Dakota had brought his old guitar, and we spent the evening around the campfire, talking and laughing, the stars twinkling above us like diamonds scattered across the sky. Around midnight, we heard something in the distance, a sound that didn't belong in the forest. It was like a high-pitched whistle, but more eerie and unsettling. Dakota and Micah exchanged glances, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. "What do you think that is?" Micah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just some animal," Dakota said, though he didn't sound convinced. We tried to brush it off, but the sound came again, closer this time. I felt a chill run through me, and it wasn't from the cool night air. We decided to call it a night and crawled into our tents. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching us. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud scream. It was Micah. I scrambled out of my tent, my heart pounding in my chest. Dakota was already out, flashlight in hand, shining it around wildly. "Micah, where are you?" Dakota shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. There was no response, just the sound of rustling leaves and the creek gurgling nearby. We spent hours searching, calling out for him, but Micah was gone. As dawn broke, we decided to hike back to the car and drive to the nearest ranger station for help. The rangers organized a search party, but days passed with no sign of Micah. The whole town got involved, everyone from the local sheriff to the high school football team. Despite their best efforts, Micah had vanished without a trace. The weeks that followed were a blur. Dakota was inconsolable, blaming himself for his brother's disappearance. I tried to be there for him, but I was struggling with my own feelings of guilt and fear. What had happened to Micah? And what was that sound we'd heard? One evening, about a month after Micah had disappeared, I was working late in the garage. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the floor. I heard a noise outside, footsteps crunching on the gravel. I looked up, expecting to see Dakota, but there was no one there. I stepped outside, peering into the darkness. The air was still, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets. I was about to go back inside when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. "Hey!" I called out, taking a step forward. The figure didn't move. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, gangly limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I realized it wasn't human. I ran back into the garage, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, dialing Dakota's number. It rang and rang, but there was no answer. I spent the rest of the night locked in the garage, too afraid to leave. The next day, I told Dakota what I'd seen. He looked at me with a mix of disbelief and desperation. We decided to go back to the Blue Range, hoping to find some clue, some sign of what had happened to Micah. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting a golden glow over the forest. The place looked the same, but there was an eerie silence, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. We hiked to our old campsite, the memory of that night still fresh in our minds. As we approached the creek, we saw something that made our blood run cold. There, on the ground, was Micah's backpack. It was torn and dirty, but unmistakably his. We picked it up, our hands trembling, and started searching the area. That's when we heard it, the same high-pitched whistle from that night. It was closer now, almost as if it was surrounding us. We spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again, the figure from the night outside the garage. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us with cold, unblinking eyes. I could see it more clearly now. It had pale, almost translucent skin stretched tight over its bones, and its face was devoid of any features except for those eyes, dark and soulless. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Dakota's arm and pulling him towards the path. We sprinted through the forest, the sound of the whistle growing louder and more insistent. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. We stumbled upon a cabin, hidden among the trees. The door was unlocked, and we burst inside, slamming it shut behind us. We were panting, our hearts racing as we tried to catch our breath. "What the hell was that?" Dakota whispered, his face pale with fear. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I don't think it's human." We spent the night in the cabin, taking turns keeping watch. Every so often we'd hear the whistle, faint and distant, but it never came close. When morning finally came, we made our way back to the car and drove straight to the sheriff's office. We told Sheriff Irwin everything, the sound, the figure, finding Micah's backpack. He listened carefully, his face grave. He didn't dismiss us, but I could tell he was skeptical. He promised to send another search party out to the area, but I wasn't sure what good it would do. The search party didn't find anything. No sign of the figure, no trace of Micah. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. Dakota and I were left with more questions than answers, haunted by the memory of that night. Life in Peniel went back to normal, or at least as normal as it could be with Micah still missing. Dakota moved away, unable to stay in a place that held so many painful memories. I stayed, but I was never the same. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever had taken Micah was still out there. Years passed, and the story of Micah's disappearance became a local legend. People would whisper about it around campfires, embellishing the details until it was more myth than reality. But I knew the truth. I knew that something was out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for its next victim. One night, I was closing up the garage when I heard it again, the whistle. My heart stopped, and I stood frozen, listening. It was faint, but unmistakable. I grabbed a flashlight and headed towards the woods, my mind racing. I followed the sound, my flashlight casting long shadows on the ground. The trees seemed to close in around me, the air growing colder with each step. I reached the clearing where we'd found Micah's backpack, and there it was, the figure, standing just at the edge of the light. It looked at me, those dark, empty eyes boring into my soul. I felt a surge of anger and fear, a yearning for answers. I stepped forward, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. "Where's Micah?" The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I took another step forward, and then another, until I was standing right in front of it. Suddenly it reached out, its long, bony fingers wrapping around my wrist. I tried to pull away, but its grip was like iron. I felt a sharp pain, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground, the morning sun filtering through the trees. I sat up, my head throbbing. The figure was gone, but in its place was a small, carved stone. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was smooth and cold, with strange symbols etched into its surface. I took the stone back to town, hoping someone might be able to decipher it. I showed it to everyone I could think of: historians, archaeologists, even a few medicine men from the reservation. No one could tell me what it meant. The years went by, and I kept the stone as a reminder of that night. Dakota and I drifted apart, each of us trying to move on in our own way. But I never forgot what happened in the Blue Range, and I never stopped wondering what really took Micah. One evening, a few years after that final encounter, I got a call from Dakota. He sounded different, more at peace than I'd heard him in years. He told me he'd met someone who might have some answers, a woman named Eloise, a healer from the Hopi tribe. I drove out to meet Dakota and Eloise, hoping against hope that she could shed some light on the mystery. Eloise was an elderly woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She listened patiently as I recounted everything, her expression thoughtful. When I finished, she took the stone from me, turning it over in her hands. "This is a warning," she said softly, "an ancient symbol meant to protect the bearer from dark spirits." I felt a shiver run through me. "Dark spirits?" Eloise nodded. "There are things in this world that we do not understand, Elias. Creatures that exist in the shadows, feeding on fear and pain. Your friend Micah may have fallen victim to one of these beings." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Is there any way to stop it, to bring Micah back?" Eloise shook her head sadly. "Once they take someone, they do not return them. but you can protect yourself and others from suffering the same fate. She taught us a ritual, a way to cleanse the land and ward off the creature. Dakota and I performed the ritual together, hoping to finally lay the past to rest. We returned to the Blue Range one last time, carrying the stone and the knowledge Eloise had given us. As we performed the ritual, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The air seemed lighter, the forest less foreboding. We buried the stone at the center of the clearing, marked the spot with a circle of stones. I don't know if it worked, if we truly banished the creature from that place, but I do know that I haven't heard the whistle since. Dakota and I have tried to move on, though the memory of Micah still lingers. I still live in Pineal, still work as a mechanic. Life is quieter now, the days blending into one another, but every now and then I'll catch a glimpse of the forest, and I'll remember. I'll remember the sound, the figure, and the stone, and I'll wonder, just for a moment, what else is out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. Back in 1991, I had a comfortable routine. I was a park ranger in Virginia, stationed in the Jefferson National Forest. Now, before you think I'm one of those nature-loving, tree-hugging rangers, let me set the record straight. I took the job because it was quiet. I didn't need people around me. After a messy divorce, the last thing I wanted was to deal with anyone else's nonsense. The forest was my refuge, a place where I could get away from all the people who thought they had me figured out. The peace of isolation was the best therapist I could ask for. I guess I've always been a bit of a loner. I grew up in a small town where the biggest excitement was the Friday night high school football game, and the best thing you could do for fun was leave. I took off the moment I had the chance and never looked back. Got into the habit of not relying on anyone but myself. It's a bad habit, I guess, but it works for me. Being a park ranger fit me like a glove. No one cared if I showed up unshaven or wore the same flannel shirt 3 days in a row. Anyway, it was late afternoon when I got a call from dispatch. Some idiot hiker went missing. This kind of thing happened all the time. City folks think they can take on the wilderness without a clue how to survive outside of Starbucks. I figured it would be an easy in and out, find the guy, slap him with a lecture, and call it a day. But it wasn't. I headed out with a coworker, Henry, another ranger. Henry was the opposite of me. He was the type that actually enjoyed guiding tourists and telling them about the flora and fauna. I never understood that. People should just learn to look things up themselves. We reached the trailhead just as the sky started getting dim. Henry was chatting away, telling me about his new dog or something. I wasn't listening. Something about the air felt wrong, heavier. I didn't believe in omens or anything like that, but you know when you just feel like something's off? That was me right then. The trail was overgrown, barely used. The missing hiker had been out here for over 24 hours, and Henry was still acting like this was some weekend hike. I finally had to tell him to shut up so I could focus. The woods were eerily quiet, no birds, no wind rustling the trees. Even Henry noticed it after a while and fell silent. We found the guy's pack first. It was torn apart, not like an animal attack, more like something or someone had grabbed it and ripped it open with force. There were claw marks, long and jagged, like nothing I'd ever seen before. Henry crouched down to examine it, but he wasn't saying much now either. We both knew this was bad news. The sun was almost down by the time we heard the first scream. It was distant, but clear, definitely human. We picked up our pace, moving fast through the brush. Every step felt like it was taking me deeper into something I didn't want to understand. The trail led us to a small clearing, and there I saw it. The hiker, or what was left of him. His body was sprawled out in a mess of blood and torn limbs, pieces of him scattered like someone had thrown him against the trees. Henry gagged. I didn't. It was brutal, sure, but I'd seen enough hunting accidents to have a tough stomach. What bothered me was, what did it? That's when I heard it behind us, a sound like heavy breathing mixed with a strange clicking noise. I spun around, rifle in hand. We weren't supposed to carry guns, but I always kept one on me, forest rules be damned. I wasn't about to be unarmed in the middle of nowhere. Henry, though, he didn't even have a knife. Dumbass. It stepped out of the trees before I even had a chance to process what it was. Standing on two legs, its body was covered in what looked like matted, dark fur. But it wasn't like any animal I'd seen before. It was long and hunched over, like a bear that had been starved for weeks, except its front limbs were too long, and the way it moved, it was wrong. Its mouth hung open, full of jagged, crooked teeth. But what threw me was the way it stood there, just staring, as if it was calculating what to do next. Henry froze. I didn't blame him. The thing had eyes like a predator, but its movements were almost human, like something in between. The rifle felt useless in my hands. I was used to shooting at deer, or maybe the occasional wild dog, not whatever this was. It lunged. Henry went down first, faster than I could blink. The thing was on him, and there was nothing I could do. I heard bones cracking, the sound of flesh tearing. It was awful. Henry screamed, but it didn't last long. I took my shot, more out of panic than anything. I missed. It didn't stop. Whatever the hell it was, it kept ripping into Henry like it didn't even care I was there. I fired again, this time hitting it square in the back. It turned to me, snarling, and for a second I thought I was next. But instead of charging, it bolted back into the trees, disappearing into the brush faster than anything that size should have been able to move. I didn't stick around to see if it was coming back. I ran. I don't know how long I was running for, but by the time I reached the trailhead, I was drenched in sweat, heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode. I radioed for backup, not even caring if they thought I was insane. I didn't even know what to tell them, just that Henry was dead, and something was out there. They sent a whole search team out after that, along with a couple of cops, but no one found anything. No blood, no body, no sign of Henry. The official report said it was likely a bear attack, that Henry got mauled and dragged off. But I know better. Bears don't do that. And whatever killed Henry, it wasn't anything I could explain. I went back to work a few weeks later, mostly because I didn't know what else to do. Life goes on, right? People die in the woods. That's what everyone kept telling me. But every time I go out on patrol now, I feel it. Like something's watching me. I don't talk about it with anyone. No one would believe me anyway. The forest used to be my refuge, a place where I could escape the noise and chaos of the world. But now, it's a constant reminder of the horror I witnessed, the fear I felt, and the friend I lost. The silence that once brought me peace now echoes with the creature's growls, and the memory of Henry's screams. And every time I step into the woods, I can't help but wonder if I'll be the next one to disappear without a trace. You know, I wasn't always this guy, living in the middle of nowhere, avoiding people. I said, glancing at the old cabin I called home. But after what happened back in 2007, I realized solitude isn't just a choice, it's a necessity. My name's Roy Bellamy. I used to be a plumber, working jobs all over, from city high-rises to rural homes. The money was good, but the hassle wasn't. I always had this urge to just get away, leave the hustle behind. So, in Nothing 6, I packed up and found myself a little corner of northern Idaho, right in the thick of the St. Joe National Forest. Nothing but trees, wildlife, and a handful of neighbors who minded their own business. I thought I was living the dream. Then, on this particular day in July 2007, I got a call from Fred, an old-timer who owned a hunting lodge about 5 miles deeper into the forest. His well had dried up and he asked if I could come by and check out the pump. Simple job, just another excuse to drive through the woods. Fred was a good guy, paid on time, and made a mean stew. I figured I could knock out the job and hang around for dinner. So I loaded up my truck with tools, tossed in a spare flashlight, and headed out. The trail to Fred's place was rough, barely maintained, but I knew it well enough. The woods here were dense, dark, and honestly a bit unsettling, even after living out there for a year, but nothing had ever happened to make me worry. At least not yet. About halfway there, something caught my eye. I noticed a figure standing on the side of the trail, just a few yards off. A woman, maybe. She looked out of place. No backpack, no gear, just standing there like she was lost. Her clothes were dirty, torn in places, but I couldn't see her face too well. At first, I thought she might have been a hiker in trouble, so I slowed down. But the second I rolled down my window, I regretted it. She didn't say a word, just stared, her head tilted like she was studying me. And then she smiled, a wide, unsettling grin that looked like it hurt her face. I've seen people on bad trips before, folks who got lost in the woods and found something stronger than mushrooms. But this was different. There was something wrong with her, something primal, like she wasn't quite human. I didn't wait for her to do anything else. I hit the gas and kept going, leaving her behind in a cloud of dust. The whole encounter left me rattled. As soon as I was out of sight, I pulled over to catch my breath. My mind was spinning with all kinds of questions. Who the hell was that? What was she doing out here? I didn't have any good answers, so I decided to push it aside and focus on Fred's well. I pulled up to his lodge about 20 minutes later. The place was dead quiet, which wasn't unusual. Fred liked his solitude too, but there was something off. No birds, no wind, just that eerie, suffocating silence. "Fred," I called, stepping out of the truck. Nothing, no response. The hairs on my arms stood up. Something wasn't right. I walked around the side of the lodge, my toolbox heavy in my hand, and spotted the well. It looked fine at a glance, but when I got closer, I saw that the pump was torn apart, like someone had taken a crowbar to it. Fred wasn't the type to let his equipment fall apart like that, and if he needed to break something, he'd have used proper tools. This wasn't his work. "Fred," I called again, louder this time. No answer. That's when I noticed the cabin door slightly ajar. I walked up the steps slowly, listening. The boards creaked under my weight, and I realized I was holding my breath. I reached the door, pushed it open with my foot, and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell, metallic, heavy, the unmistakable stench of blood. Fred was sitting at his table, slumped over, his hands twisted at unnatural angles. His chest was torn open, ribs exposed, his insides a mess of flesh and blood. I froze, my body wouldn't move, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. It wasn't just a killing, it was a butchering. A sound behind me snapped me back into reality. I turned, eyes darting, and saw them two figures crouched in the far corner of the cabin, just watching me. Both men, I think, though they looked more like feral animals than people. Their clothes were ragged, covered in dried blood and filth. Their faces were gaunt, wild, like they hadn't seen a bath in years. I backed up slowly, trying to get to the door, but they stood, almost in unison, and started moving toward me, their heads low, like wolves stalking prey. "Hey now," I said, raising my hands. "I don't want any trouble." One of them let out this sound, half laugh, half grunt, and that's when I knew reasoning was out the window. They were predators and I was meat. I turned and bolted, slamming the door behind me. I ran to the truck, hands shaking, barely managing to get the keys in the ignition. They were right behind me. I could hear their footsteps, faster than any human had a right to be. I floored it, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped away, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, expecting to see them. But there was nothing, just the trees and that ever-present silence. I didn't stop driving until I got back to my cabin. I locked every door, every window, grabbed my shotgun from the closet, and sat in the dark, waiting. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Every noise, every rustle of the wind, set me on edge. Morning came, and with it a sense of false security. I convinced myself I'd call the sheriff, tell him what I saw, though I doubted he'd believe a word of it. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But before I could even pick up the phone, there was a knock at the door. I froze, my grip tightening on the shotgun. Another knock. This one softer, more deliberate. "Roy, it's me," a voice called from outside. "Open up." It was Fred's voice. No way. There was no way it was him, but it was. And it wasn't. I looked through the window, shotgun still in hand, and saw him standing there. Only it wasn't Fred, not really. His face was pale, eyes glassy, mouth stretched into that same unnerving smile I saw on the woman in the woods. I didn't open the door. Instead, I watched as he just stood there, smiling, waiting. Then slowly he turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the forest. I never called the sheriff, never spoke about what I saw. But every now and then, when I'm outside chopping wood or fixing the roof, I catch glimpses of them, those people or things. Whatever they are watching from the trees, they're still out there, somewhere in the depths of the St. Joe National Forest. They're waiting, and I'll never be able to shake the feeling that one day they'll come back for me. They say people who live out here like I do choose solitude over sanity. Maybe they're right, but I didn't have many other options after my wife left me. No warning, just a note on the fridge. I figured my time in the city was done. Sold what little I had left, bought an old trailer, and found myself a patch of land far enough away from civilization that I wouldn't have to see another person unless I wanted to. Not that I ever wanted to. This was 2010, a year that still makes me laugh because it was supposed to be the start of something better. That's what my ex-wife used to say. The name's Garrett Durst. It's not a name that gets tossed around in polite circles, but I'm not a man of polite circles anymore. Haven't been for years. Most of my days are spent working on the trailer, fixing leaks, making the place habitable, if you could call it that. If it wasn't for the occasional hunting trip or hike through the woods, I'd probably go mad. I've got some dark humor to keep me company. I guess you could call that a coping mechanism. Why don't ghosts haunt the forest? Because all the spirits get axed before they get too close. Yeah, it's lame, but it keeps me entertained. My land sits somewhere near the Idaho-Montana border, far from any real town or road. It's the kind of place that doesn't even show up on GPS, so I don't worry about company. No phone signal, no electricity, just me, the woods, and whatever decides to wander through. A few hunters pass by now and then, but mostly it's quiet. Until it wasn't. I was in the middle of replacing some rotting wood on the trailer siding when I noticed it. The eerie quiet. The birds that usually sang all day were gone. No rustling leaves or snapping twigs from squirrels or deer. It was just silence, like someone hit a mute button on the world. I remember thinking, well, maybe nature finally decided to give me a break. But that thought was cut short when I heard the first scream. It was distant, probably a mile or so out. But it wasn't an animal sound. No, this was a person, high-pitched, panicked. I dropped my hammer, my mind racing through every reason why someone would be screaming that far out. We don't get hikers out here. At least none that survived long enough to scream like that. I grabbed my shotgun. I don't usually carry it around with me. Hadn't needed to in years. But something about that scream put a pit in my stomach. You know, the kind that only shows up when you know something's wrong. I stuffed a few extra shells into my pockets and headed out into the woods. It was easy to follow the sound. It didn't stop. The trees were dense, but I know this land like the back of my hand. It's my backyard after all. About 15 minutes into my walk, I found the source. 2 men, or at least what was left of them. They were torn apart. Bodies strewn across the clearing like rag dolls, blood pooling into the grass. One of them was missing half his face, his jaw hanging on by a thread. The other, well, there wasn't much left to describe. I'm no stranger to hunting accidents, but this wasn't something a bear or mountain lion could do. No, this was deliberate, violent, like whatever did this wanted to make a point. And it didn't take long for me to figure out that it was still nearby. I heard it before I saw it, heavy footsteps, the kind that make the earth tremble a little. I turned slowly, my shotgun raised, ready for whatever was coming, but nothing could have prepared me for what stepped out of the trees. It was big, probably about 7 feet tall, with long matted fur that clung to its body in clumps. The thing looked like a cross between a man and a wolf. But worse, much worse. It stood on 2 legs but hunched, its long arms ending in claws that were caked in dried blood. And its teeth, God, the teeth. It didn't snarl or roar, just stood there breathing heavy, watching me. I fired off a shot. It hit, but it didn't stop the thing. It staggered back, more out of surprise than pain, before it charged. I barely had time to pump another shell before it was on me. I managed to duck just as one of those claws swiped where my head had been. I hit the ground hard but scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't look back, didn't want to see how close it was. I could hear it though, crashing through the trees behind me, getting closer. I made it back to the trailer and slammed the door shut, locking it, as if that would stop something like that. I could hear it outside, circling, testing the windows, the door. It let out a low sound, not a roar or a growl, just this deep, guttural noise that vibrated through the walls. I reloaded the shotgun, my hand shaking. I wasn't sure if it was fear or adrenaline, but I wasn't about to sit around and find out. The thing slammed into the side of the trailer, the entire structure rocking from the force. It didn't care about the door. It was going to rip its way inside, one way or another. I had one shot, maybe two if I was lucky, so I waited, my back pressed against the far wall, shotgun aimed at the door. It hit again, harder this time. The door buckled, hinges groaning under the pressure. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and then it happened. The door flew off its hinges, crashing into the opposite wall. The creature stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the fading light outside. It stepped in, its massive frame barely fitting through the door frame. I didn't wait. I pulled the trigger. The blast hit it square in the chest, and for a moment I thought I had it. But it didn't go down. It stumbled, blood oozing from the wound, but it didn't fall. It looked at me, more annoyed than anything, and I realized I was out of options. That's when I heard the second scream. It wasn't from outside. It was from inside the trailer, somewhere in the back. My heart sank. I wasn't alone in here. I backed up, my shotgun empty, nowhere to run. The creature took a step forward, and then it stopped, its head snapping toward the back room. I heard the scream again, louder this time, closer, and then something else, something I'll never forget. A second one. There was a second one of those things, but smaller, faster. It darted out from the shadows, slamming into the larger creature. They tumbled together, clawing, biting, tearing into each other. I didn't stick around to watch the rest. I ran. I made it outside, not stopping until I hit the tree line. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I stopped, my lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly. I collapsed against a tree, listening. I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own breathing, but I wasn't about to take any chances. When I finally made it back to the trailer, the place was trashed. The creatures were gone, but the damage they left behind wasn't something I could ignore. Blood, fur, and claw marks covered every surface. The door was gone, windows shattered, walls torn open like paper. But it wasn't just the destruction that bothered me. It was the bodies, those two men I found earlier. They weren't there anymore. Something had taken them. Something had dragged them off into the woods. I don't know what those things were, but I know they're still out there somewhere, in those woods. I can hear them sometimes at night. Not close, but not far enough away to feel safe. I've thought about leaving, packing up and finding somewhere else to hide. But where do you go when the monsters already know where you live? So, I stay. I've reinforced the trailer, made it as secure as I can. I keep the shotgun loaded, shells within reach at all times. I've started sleeping during the day, keeping watch at night. I haven't seen them again, but I know they're out there, waiting. I can feel it, and I'll be ready when they come. It started on a pretty typical Tuesday in 2009, in the woods of Dunsmuir, California. My name's Jonas Klein, and I don't usually get involved in stuff like this. I'm more of a live and let live kind of guy, you know? Anyway, it all kicked off when I decided to go for a hike, clear my head. I was dealing with some personal stuff. Nothing major, just the usual life gets you down kind of crap. So there I was, wandering through the trees, thinking about everything and nothing. The morning was quiet, except for the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves. Dunsmuir is known for its rugged beauty, lots of trees, rivers, and peace, perfect for someone needing to get lost in their thoughts. I was halfway up one of the lesser-known trails when I spotted it, a cabin I hadn't seen before. Now, I've hiked these trails for years, and never once did I come across this place. I wasn't armed, just a Swiss Army knife and a lot of curiosity. What's a guy like me going to do with a gun anyway? The cabin looked old, almost like it had been there for decades. The wood was weathered, windows covered in grime. There was no path leading to it, which was odd. Maybe it was abandoned? My curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to take a closer look. As I approached, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I stepped onto the creaky porch and gave it a gentle push. It swung open with a long, eerie creak. I'm not the type to go snooping around other people's property, but this place seemed forgotten. Inside, it was dark and musty, filled with old furniture draped in dust sheets. The whole vibe was straight out of a horror movie. But I wasn't scared, more intrigued than anything. I wandered through the rooms, noticing old photographs on the walls, black and white mostly, of landscapes and a few people. One picture caught my eye. It was of a family standing right outside this cabin. They looked happy, but something about their eyes gave me the creeps. Just then I heard it, a faint shuffling noise coming from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. Now, common sense would tell anyone to get the hell out of there. But me? I decided to investigate. I slowly climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under my weight. At the top, the noise was clearer, like someone dragging something across the floor. The hallway was dimly lit, the only light coming from a cracked window at the end. I followed the sound to a closed door on the right. I hesitated, hand hovering over the knob. Then, summoning whatever courage I had, I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, probably a kid's room once upon a time. There were toys scattered around, an old bed against the wall, and there, in the middle of the room, was a figure hunched over something on the floor. It was big, covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. It turned around slowly, revealing a face that was more animal than human. A snout, sharp teeth, but with humanoid eyes staring right through me. Before I could react, it lunged at me. I managed to sidestep, but not before it raked its claws across my arm. The pain was sharp, intense. I stumbled back, clutching my bleeding arm. The creature snarled and came at me again. This time, I was ready. I grabbed a wooden chair and swung it with all my might. It shattered against the creature's head, stunning it for a moment. I took my chance and bolted out of the room, down the stairs and out of the cabin. My mind was racing. What the hell was that thing? I had to get out of there, warn someone. I ran down the trail, blood dripping from my arm, the adrenaline keeping me going. But I knew I needed to get help soon. I reached the trailhead and jumped into my truck. I sped down the dirt road towards town, my mind still reeling from the encounter. I burst into the sheriff's office, babbling about the creature and the cabin. Sheriff Maxwell, a grizzled veteran with a no-nonsense attitude, looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Jonas, you sure you didn't just spook yourself?" he asked, eyeing my bloody arm. "I'm telling you, Max, there's something out there. It's not human. It attacked me," I insisted, my voice shaking. He sighed and grabbed his radio. "All right, let's go take a look." We drove back to the cabin, me in the passenger seat, clutching my makeshift bandage. Maxwell didn't say much, probably thinking I was crazy. When we arrived, the place looked just as eerie as before. I led him to the room where I'd seen the creature. The door was still open, but the room was empty. No sign of the creature, just blood, my blood, on the floor. Maxwell looked around, frowning. "Whatever you saw, it's gone now, but we can't just leave it at that. We need to find out what's going on." We spent the rest of the day searching the area, finding nothing. I felt like I was losing my mind. Was it all a hallucination? But the pain in my arm and the blood said otherwise. Maxwell decided to call in some experts, figuring it might be a wild animal, though I knew it was something far more sinister. Later that evening, as we sat in the sheriff's office, a man walked in. He was tall, with a rugged face and piercing eyes. He introduced himself as Dr. Leon Vass, an anthropologist specializing in cryptids and folklore. "I heard about your encounter," he said, looking at me with interest. "Mind if I ask you some questions?" We went over the details again, and he listened intently. "What you described sounds like a legend I've heard before," he said. "Locals call it the Wendigo, a creature said to be a former human who resorted to cannibalism and transformed into a beast." I shook my head. It looked like some kind of Bigfoot, but more vicious, more human. Vass nodded. "The lines between myth and reality are often blurred. But I believe you saw something real, something dangerous." Over the next few hours, Vass, Maxwell, and I planned a return to the cabin at dawn. We gathered supplies, flashlights, and weapons. I borrowed a shotgun from the sheriff's armory, figuring it might even the odds. I was determined to face whatever it was, partly out of fear, but also a strange sense of responsibility. The next morning, we made our way back to the cabin. The woods seemed darker, more foreboding as we approached. Vass motioned for us to stay quiet. We moved silently, weapons at the ready. Inside the cabin, it was just as we left it. But something felt off, a heaviness in the air. We split up, each taking a different part of the house. I went back upstairs, heart pounding in my chest. The kids' room was still empty, but I felt like I was being watched. Suddenly, a crash from downstairs sent me running back. I found Vass and Maxwell in the living room, staring at a broken window. "It's here, boss," Vass whispered, clutching a flashlight and a pistol. "Stay close." We moved outside, scanning the tree line. Then we saw it, the creature lurking at the edge of the woods. It stood there, watching us with those unnerving eyes. I raised my shotgun, but Vas put a hand on my arm. "Wait, let's see what it does." The creature stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate. It sniffed the air, then let out a low guttural snarl. Without warning, it charged. Maxwell fired, hitting it in the shoulder, but it barely flinched. It was on us in seconds. I fired my shotgun, the blast echoing through the trees. The creature recoiled, blood spraying from its side. "Keep firing," Voss shouted as he unloaded his pistol into the beast. Maxwell reloaded his rifle, taking aim. The creature lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. I struggled to keep it at bay, its claws tearing at my clothes. Just as it went for my throat, Maxwell's rifle cracked, and the creature slumped to the ground, dead. I lay there, breathing hard, staring at the lifeless body. It looked even more monstrous up close, a grotesque blend of human and animal. Vas knelt beside me, checking my wounds. "You're lucky," he said, helping me to my feet. "But we need to get out of here. There might be more of them." We hurried back to the truck, leaving the cabin and its horrors behind. As we drove back to town, the reality of what happened started to sink in. Maxwell radioed for backup, and soon the area was swarming with law enforcement and wildlife experts. They found no other creatures, but the body was taken for study. The analysis confirmed what we already knew. This was no ordinary animal. It was something else entirely, something that defied explanation. The creature was never seen again, but the fear it instilled lingered. The woods around Dunsmore held a new kind of silence, a silence heavy with the knowledge of what lurked within. And I, once a carefree wanderer, now tread carefully, always aware of the shadows that dance just beyond the reach of the light. I had no idea that a simple RV camping trip could turn into a nightmare. But then again, life has a funny way of throwing you into the unexpected. My name's Heron Mackenzie, and I'm not the type to scare easily. I've faced my share of hardships, from losing my parents young to surviving a few close calls as a firefighter, but nothing prepared me for what happened last summer. It was a Friday when I set out, the kind of day where the weather's just right and you can smell the promise of adventure in the air. I had my trusty RV packed with all the essentials, food, gear, a few good books. My destination was the dense, untamed forest just outside of Redding, California. The place had a reputation among outdoor enthusiasts for its challenging terrain and breathtaking views. But it was also known for its isolation. That was exactly what I was looking for. A break from the chaos of city life. After a few hours of driving and navigating rough trails, I found the perfect spot, nestled between towering redwoods, beside a clear, babbling stream. It was paradise, or so I thought. I spent the day hiking and fishing, feeling the kind of peace that only nature can offer. As dusk settled, I built a fire and settled into my camping chair with a beer, watching the stars slowly emerge in the darkening sky. It was one of those moments where everything seemed right with the world. Little did I know it wouldn't last. Around midnight, I was awakened by a sound, a rustling that was too close to be just an animal. I sat up, my heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table. Swinging the beam around, I saw nothing at first. But then, just beyond the perimeter of my camp, a shadow moved. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. I was starting to think I'd imagined it when the shadow moved again, and this time it was closer. I scrambled out of the RV, flashlight in one hand and a hunting knife in the other. The beam of light fell on a man, dirty and disheveled, with a wild look in his eyes. He didn't respond to my shouts, just kept inching closer, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Stay back," I warned, my grip tightening on the knife. But he didn't. He lunged at me, and I barely managed to dodge. In the struggle, my flashlight hit the ground, casting erratic shadows that only added to the chaos. I fought him off, my training kicking in. He was strong, crazed even, but I managed to knock him to the ground. Panting, I backed away, never taking my eyes off him. He just lay there, staring at me with those wild eyes, not saying a word. I kept the knife pointed at him as I grabbed my phone to call the authorities. But of course, there was no signal out here. I had to get him to town, but I wasn't about to let him ride in my RV. "Get up," I commanded. And surprisingly, he complied. I kept him at knife point as I led him to the RV, making him sit in a makeshift cage I fashioned out of some bungee cords and a spare tarp. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. I drove through the night, adrenaline keeping me alert. The man didn't say a word, just stared straight ahead. When we finally reached the outskirts of Reading, I pulled into the first gas station I saw and called 911. The cops arrived quickly, and I explained what had happened. They took him into custody, thanking me for my vigilance. I thought that was the end of it, a bizarre encounter with a drifter, but it was only the beginning. The next day, as I was packing up to leave, I found something near my campsite that chilled me to the bone. A shallow grave, freshly dug. Inside, the mutilated body of a young woman, her face twisted in a final silent scream. The police were called again, and this time they took a keen interest in my story. They searched the area and found more graves, each containing a body in a similar state of gruesome death. The man I had encountered was a serial killer, preying on campers and hikers in the remote wilderness. He had been living off the grid, his campsite a macabre shrine to his victims. The media dubbed him the Redwood Butcher, and the story made headlines for weeks. I was hailed as a hero for capturing him, but I didn't feel like one. I had stumbled into a nightmare and barely survived. In the aftermath, I couldn't shake the images of what I'd seen. The faces of his victims haunted me, their lives cut short by a madman. I took some time off work and saw a therapist to help process everything. It wasn't easy, but eventually, I found a way to move on. I still go camping, but I'm more cautious now. I always let someone know where I'm going, and I never go to such isolated spots alone. The wilderness still calls to me, but now I'm acutely aware of the dangers it can hide. As for the Redwood Butcher, he was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life without parole. I testified at his trial, recounting the harrowing encounter in detail. It was a small comfort to know he'd never hurt anyone again, but it didn't bring back the lives he'd taken. Life goes on, and so do I. I've learned to appreciate the moments of peace even more now, knowing how quickly they can be shattered. And when I sit by the campfire, staring into the flames, I can't help but remember that night in the woods, and the terror that lurked just beyond the light. But I don't let it control me. I won't let fear dictate my life. I still seek adventure, still find joy in the great outdoors. I just do so with a little more wisdom and a lot more caution. I never gave them much thought. Skinwalkers, Wendigo, spirits, just stories. Then I moved to the reservation. I was assigned to work as a park ranger in a remote stretch of land near the Navajo Nation, a place where the mountains are jagged, and the land feels as ancient as time itself. It was my first real job in the field after training, and I thought I could handle whatever nature could throw at me. But I was wrong. It all started the way these things usually do, with a quiet warning. I was in the ranger station when I first met Tom, an old Navajo man who lived near the edge of the reservation. He was the type of person who spoke rarely, but when he did, everyone listened. I'd seen him around, his weathered face always serious, eyes sharp, like he saw things no one else did. He never offered a greeting, just a nod. One afternoon he came into the station, looked at me with those piercing eyes, and said something that still chills me to my core. "They're worse than skinwalkers, Ranger." At first I thought he was talking about some new threat to the wildlife, perhaps a predator spotted near the park. But there was a weight in his voice, something that made me pause. He had always seemed so calm, yet now he was on edge, visibly uncomfortable. "You talking about a pack of wolves or something else?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. Tom didn't answer me right away. Instead, he stared out the window, his brow furrowing as though he were thinking of something long buried. Then he spoke again. "You need to be careful out there. The land is ancient, and there are things in those woods. Things older than the people who walk here now. Things worse than skinwalkers." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Those things can wear the skin of animals, but what I'm talking about, they wear the skin of us." I thought the old man was losing his mind. I laughed it off to myself, deciding it was just one of those superstitions passed down through generations. But something about the way he said it unsettled me. There was a warning in his voice I couldn't ignore. A week later, I'd wish I had. The park I patrolled was far from any city, surrounded by thick forests and steep cliffs. The locals rarely visited unless they had business on the reservation, which made it a peaceful, isolated place, just how I liked it. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest began to settle into darkness, I found myself drawn deeper into the woods than I intended. I was on a routine patrol, checking for illegal hunting traps, when I stumbled upon something strange. The forest had fallen unnervingly silent. The usual hum of insects and chirping of birds had vanished. In its place, there was a heavy, suffocating stillness. My flashlight flickered as I walked, casting long shadows across the trees. Then I saw it. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a figure, tall and hunched, moving through the trees with unnerving speed. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person, but the shape was wrong. Too long, too thin, too unnatural. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. I wasn't sure why, but I knew deep down that whatever I was seeing wasn't a creature of this world. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. Something about the figure, its movement, its stillness made me want to stay quiet. as if by speaking I would draw its attention. I turned and started walking back, slowly, trying to keep my footsteps light, my breath shallow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, stalked from just beyond the trees. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The image of the creature haunted me, its dark, glimmering eyes, its hollow, human-like limbs. I had seen things in the wild, but this felt different. The weight of Tom's warning, the way he'd spoken of things that wore human skin, gnawed at me like a persistent itch. The next day, I went to Tom, hoping for answers. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, but something had happened that I couldn't explain. When I found him, he was sitting on his porch, staring out at the vast, empty land. His face was grave. I sat down beside him without saying a word. He knew why I was there. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low and calm. I nodded. "The one you saw last night," he said, his eyes not leaving the horizon. "That wasn't a skinwalker. That was worse. Much worse." I swallowed. "What are they then?" "They are the ones who were here before us. They are the ones who have always been here. Skinwalkers are just a story. They are a small thing compared to what lies in the heart of these woods. These creatures, these things, they are not flesh and bone. They're older than any curse. They were the ones who made the land what it is, and they've never left." He paused, glancing at me, his eyes narrowing. "They wear the skin of humans, not animals, and they can walk like us, talk like us. They can even be us if they want. You'll never know who's one of them until it's too late." That night I went back to the woods. I wasn't sure why, but something inside me told me I had to. I had to see the truth. I wasn't going to find answers if I stayed in the ranger station, hiding behind my reports and patrols. The forest was darker than I remembered. The air felt thicker, the shadows deeper. And then I saw it again, the same figure moving between the trees. Only this time, I wasn't alone. I could hear it whispering, words in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow I felt it in my bones. It wasn't just calling to me, it was calling to the earth itself. I stepped forward, the ground beneath me shifting unnaturally, pulling me deeper into the forest. I wanted to scream, but my throat constricted. I wanted to run, but my legs refused. The thing in the woods wasn't a skinwalker. It was something far older. And now that it had seen me, I knew it would never let me leave. When I woke up, I was back at the ranger station. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. I had no memory of how I'd gotten there or how long I'd been gone. But I knew one thing for certain. Tom was right. They are worse than skinwalkers. And they are waiting. If you hear their whispers, if you see their shadows flicker at the corner of your eye, don't follow, don't even look. Because once they know you're listening, once they know you see them, you're already lost. It was just another mission, or at least that's what they told me before they shipped me out to the thick woods of the Ozarks in Missouri back in 2011. They had this way of sending us to places that didn't show up on maps, where the rules weren't always clear, and no one bothered to ask questions when things went sideways. I was a Green Beret, used to silence, used to missions that never made it to the official reports. But even with all that, this one never sat right with me. Maybe it was the briefing, Or maybe it was the way our handler, Captain Warren, kept avoiding eye contact when he gave us the details. They dropped me and 3 others, Larson, Ortiz, and Bolton, into the woods just past midnight. We'd been told we were looking for a downed drone, a prototype that supposedly malfunctioned and crashed somewhere in the dense trees. They wanted it back intact, but Warren's face said something else, something he didn't have the clearance or the guts to tell us. Still, orders were orders, and I've never been one to ask for more than I was given. We hiked for hours, cutting through the underbrush and trying to keep track of our bearings. It wasn't easy. The trees closed in on you here, thick trunks twisting in ways that made everything look the same. And no matter how hard we tried, it felt like we were going in circles. Larson joked about it, said it was like the woods were playing tricks on us, bending space and time. He laughed, but Ortiz and I just looked at each other. There was a tightness in the air, a strange stillness, like something was waiting for us to make a mistake. By the time we found the wreckage, the sky was turning a dull gray with the first hint of daylight. The drone was there, all right, but it was smashed up beyond recognition, tangled in the roots of an oak that had probably stood there for a century. Bolton went to work, checking if any of the data storage survived. I kept watch, rifle in hand, scanning the trees. The quiet here wasn't natural. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then came the first sign that this was more than a recovery mission. Ortiz called out, pointing to something half buried under the leaves near the drone. It was a boot, military issue, but old, decades older than anything we used. The laces were frayed, and the leather was cracked, like it had been out here rotting for years. But inside the boot was a foot, shriveled and discolored, the bones sticking out in places. Larson tried to joke about it again, but his voice wavered this time. No one laughed. Captain Warren's voice crackled through the radio just as Bolton found the hard drive. He told us to bring back what we could and to be quick about it, said there'd be a storm rolling in. Ortiz, always a bit sharper than the rest of us, pressed him on it. A storm? The sky's clear. Warren hesitated. It was the first time any of us had heard him stammer. Just get back, he said, and cut the connection. We started the hike back, but the air felt heavier now, like it was pressing in from all sides. The trees seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. Ortiz cursed in Spanish under his breath, something about the woods being alive. Larson kept his mouth shut for once, which might have been the scariest part of the whole thing. Then we heard it movement, slow and deliberate, from somewhere off to our left. I signaled for silence, and we dropped into a crouch, weapons ready. The sound came again, branches cracking, something dragging through the underbrush. Whatever it was big, too big to be any animal I knew. I motioned for Larson and Ortiz to flank right, while Bolton and I moved left to circle around. We crept through the trees, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. It was hunched over, its back to me, tearing into something on the forest floor. Its limbs were long, too long, the muscles underneath rippling like it didn't belong to any creature that should be moving on 2 legs. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its frame. It was eating, gnawing at something that looked like it might have once been a deer, or maybe a person. Hard to tell with the way it was shredding through the flesh. I raised my rifle, trying to get a clear shot. But the thing must have sensed us because it straightened up, its head twisting around in a way that no neck should bend. It didn't have a face like you'd expect, just a blank, smooth stretch where features should have been. But it turned towards us like it could see. Bolton fired first, panic getting the best of him. The bullet hit, but it didn't drop, just stumbled back a step. Then it charged. We scattered, but it went after Bolton, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. I heard him scream, and then there was this wet, tearing sound, like someone pulling apart raw meat. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I grabbed Ortiz and Larson, dragging them through the trees, putting as much distance between us and that thing as possible. It wasn't far enough. We could hear it chasing us, its heavy breaths closing in behind us. Larson slipped on a patch of wet leaves, going down hard. I tried to pull him up, but the thing was on him before I could even blink. It grabbed his leg, pulled, and the sound of bone snapping made my stomach churn. He didn't scream, just let out this choked, desperate noise before it yanked him into the shadows. Ortiz and I ran, lungs burning, hearts pounding. But that thing didn't give up. I don't think it ever tired, just kept coming. We hit a clearing where the underbrush thinned, and Ortiz collapsed against a rock, clutching at his side. I could hear him wheezing, trying to catch his breath. But we didn't have time. The thing burst through the trees, moving like a twisted marionette, limbs jerking in unnatural ways. I raised my rifle and fired, aiming for where a heart might be, if it even had one. It stumbled again, but it kept coming, swiping out with those two long arms. Ortiz pulled his sidearm, unloading the whole clip into the thing's chest, but it barely slowed it. It grabbed him by the head, twisting it with a sickening crack. He dropped, lifeless, his body crumpling into the dirt. I was alone now, with nothing but a half-empty magazine and a knife. I didn't have a choice. I turned and ran, knowing full well that it wouldn't let me go. It followed, relentless, crashing through the brush. I could hear it gaining on me, but the edge of a cliff came into view, the trees thinning out. I had an idea, one last shot at making it out. As soon as I hit the edge, I spun around, raising my rifle and aiming straight at its head as it lunged forward. The shot rang out, hitting it right between where the eyes should have been. The force of the shot sent it stumbling, and it went over the edge, clawing at the air as it fell. I heard it hit the rocks below, the crunch of bone and flesh. I didn't wait to see if it would get up. I stumbled back into the woods, making my way to the extraction point. Warren's voice was still crackling in my earpiece, asking for a status update. I didn't answer, just kept moving, forcing one foot in front of the other. I made it back to where the chopper was supposed to be waiting. But when I got there, Warren wasn't alone. Men in suits, no insignia, no ranks were with him, checking over the wreckage of the drone. They barely glanced at me as I approached, covered in blood and dirt. Warren took one look at me and asked where the others were. I told him, and he just nodded, like he'd expected that answer. They loaded me onto the chopper, and the suits went back to their work. As we lifted off, I glanced back over the trees far below. I saw a shadow move, something crawling out of the rocks at the base of the cliff. I knew what that meant, but I kept it to myself. They didn't need to know, and I had no intention of telling them. Back at the base, they debriefed me, took the data Bolton had managed to recover, and sent me home with a warning to keep my mouth shut. They never asked about the thing we saw, and I never offered. I don't think they really wanted to know. They buried the whole thing under classified files and red tape. I tried to go back to my life, but it wasn't the same. A few months later, I got a call from a buddy still in the unit. He told me there had been another mission out there, different team, same location. They didn't come back. All they found were the bodies, torn apart like Larson and Ortiz. And somewhere in the mess, a set of footprints, long, narrow, with claw marks gouging the earth. It's been years now, and no one's mentioned the Ozarks mission since. But I keep an ear to the ground, listening for anything that might suggest it's still out there. It was the kind of mission that should have been a simple sweep and recon, but as soon as we got the orders, I knew it would go sideways. It's 1996, somewhere in the Green Mountains of Vermont. My name's Alex Radford. Been in the service long enough to see things most people can't stomach. But this one sticks. Not that I get nightmares or any of that. Just something that stays in the back of your mind, like a splinter. I've been with the Green Berets for a while, enough time to get good at fixing bad situations. That day they dropped us at an old logging camp, a place that hadn't seen activity in decades. The last folks here must have packed up around the 60s, judging by the rusted-up machinery half buried in the brush. My team and I, we were tasked with tracking down a couple of missing hikers. Local authorities had found a torn-up tent and a trail of blood leading into the deeper woods. The whole thing stank of something off, but orders were orders, and we weren't exactly paid to ask questions. As soon as we hit the ground, we split into pairs, me taking Sergeant Miller with me. He was a decent guy, a bit of a joker, always trying to lighten the mood. Said he thought the woods had personality. Whatever that meant, I humored him, but deep down, I knew this place didn't feel right. We followed the path the locals had marked out, stepping over tangled roots and dodging low branches. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles, and every sound was magnified in that silence, from the creak of old pines to the scuttling of animals hidden away in the underbrush. Miller kept making jokes about us being Bigfoot hunters, but I could tell he was on edge. He kept glancing over his shoulder like he was expecting something to lunge out from behind one of those moss-covered trees. I'd been through a dozen jungle ops, desert sweeps, urban raids, you name it. But this was different. No gunfire, no explosions, just the creeping sense that you weren't alone. About 4 clicks in, we found the first body, or what was left of it, sprawled across a shallow creek bed, missing an arm and half of its face. Whoever it was, they hadn't gone peacefully. Miller gagged, but I stayed focused, scanning the tree line for any movement. The wound patterns didn't match any animal I had seen, but I wasn't about to let my imagination run wild. Could have been a bear, I told myself, even though I knew that wasn't right. We radioed back to base, but the signal was already cutting out. Nothing but static and a faint reply we couldn't make out. Miller tried cracking a joke about hiking accidents, but I could hear the fear creeping into his voice. We covered the body and marked it for later, then pushed on deeper into the woods. The further we went, the thicker the trees grew. until they formed a canopy so dense it blocked out most of the daylight. It got colder too, like we'd crossed into some pocket of the forest where the air just didn't move right. That's when we found the second body, hanging from a tree by the remains of a nylon rope. The torso was split open, like something had tried to dig its way inside. No animal I know does that. Not bears, not mountain lions. Miller swore under his breath, and I shot him a look that told him to keep it together. We still had a job to do, even if it was turning into a damn horror show. We kept moving, but I knew that whatever did this, it wasn't far. The woods had gone dead quiet, like everything knew to keep its distance. I don't know if you've ever been in a place like that, but it's like the air itself is waiting for something to break the silence. We heard it before we saw it. A crunch of leaves, something heavy moving in the brush. Miller and I froze, raising our rifles. I saw a shape, low to the ground, just beyond the tree line, too fast for any bear or wolf, too deliberate in the way it moved. "You see that?" Miller whispered, his voice tight with fear. I nodded, signaling for him to circle around. We were trained for this kind of thing, but I could feel my hands sweating against the grip of my rifle. Miller moved to flank whatever it was, but then I heard a shout and a scuffle, then a wet, tearing noise that made my stomach drop. I sprinted over, barely making out shapes through the brush. But when I reached him, all I found was a dark patch spreading across the ground. I called his name, but there was no reply, just the sound of something crunching through the underbrush, moving away. My flashlight caught a glimpse of a shape disappearing into the shadows, something on all fours, but too large to be anything natural. I tried to follow, but it was like chasing smoke, always just a step out of reach, slipping deeper into the darkness. I found Miller's body half buried in a ditch, his throat torn open, and his eyes. Well, they didn't have any life left in them. I didn't have time to mourn. Whatever had done this was close, and I wasn't about to end up like him. I grabbed his dog tags, whispered an apology, and turned back towards the camp. I didn't even make it half a mile before I heard that same crunching noise, like something was chewing through bone. I spun around, rifle raised, and that's when I saw it, clear as day. It stood upright, but hunched, covered in matted, dark fur, with a body like a twisted hybrid of a man and some kind of wild animal. Its mouth hung open, filled with jagged teeth that glinted in the flashlight's beam. It moved faster than I thought possible, leaping towards me with a snarl that made my blood run cold. I fired off 3 rounds, hitting it in the shoulder. It flinched, stumbled, but kept coming. I fired again, emptying the clip into its chest, and it finally went down, twitching in the undergrowth. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at the thing lying in the leaves, waiting for it to get back up. It didn't. I forced myself to approach, kicking its head to make sure it was dead. It didn't move, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But as I leaned closer, I noticed something strange. Its skin wasn't right. It was loose, like it didn't fit the body underneath, stretched over muscles that shouldn't have been there. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, crunching through the brush. I turned around, and my blood ran cold. Another one of those things. This one even larger, its face scarred and twisted, was standing just a few yards away. It let out a noise somewhere between a hiss and a grunt, and I knew I was out of time. I bolted, sprinting through the trees, barely able to see where I was going. Branches tore at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I kept running, heart pounding like a war drum. I didn't stop until I hit the clearing where our extraction was supposed to meet us. But there was no helicopter, no backup. Just silence and the cold wind cutting through the trees. I fumbled with my radio, trying to get through to command, but all I got was static. And then, from the darkness, I saw it again. The creature, not the one I'd killed. Another one, standing just at the edge of the tree line, watching me with those empty sockets. My hand shook as I reloaded my rifle, keeping my eyes on it. It took a step forward, then another, slowly closing the distance. I raised my rifle and fired, but it ducked into the shadows, too fast for me to get a clean shot. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away, trying to keep my breathing steady. But the thing just kept following, always staying just out of range. I realized then that it wasn't hunting me. It was playing with me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I took a chance and broke into a sprint again, hearing the thing crashing through the underbrush behind me. Somehow, I made it back to the old logging camp. I ducked inside one of the rotting cabins, barring the door with whatever debris I could find. I could hear it outside, circling, the boards creaking under its weight. It wasn't trying to get in, just pacing, as if it knew I was trapped. I waited for what felt like hours, my finger hovering over the trigger, praying that whatever it was would lose interest. But it didn't. It stayed out there until the sky began to lighten. Then it finally slunk back into the woods, leaving me in that wreck of a cabin, surrounded by shadows. When dawn finally broke, I stumbled out of there, rifle clutched tight, not daring to look back. The extraction team found me wandering down an old logging road, my uniform torn and caked with dirt. They didn't believe me when I told them what happened, said I'd been through some kind of traumatic episode. They wrote off Miller's death as a wildlife attack and swept the whole thing under the rug. But I know what I saw, even if they won't admit it. Back at the camp, I found out they dug up a series of shallow graves out there in those woods. Human remains, picked clean, like they'd been left out for scavengers. They didn't put that in the report either, just buried the evidence and moved on. But I remember the bodies, the way they'd been torn apart, like something had feasted on them, one by one. And there was a pattern to it, a kind of twisted method to the way the limbs had been scattered, like whoever or whatever did this was enjoying itself. All I know is, I'm done with that place. Vermont can keep its forests, its secrets, and whatever's still out there roaming those woods. Whatever they are, they're not human, and they don't belong on any map I've ever seen. You'd think after 3 years of patrolling Glacier National Park, I'd have seen it all. But nothing prepares you for what's out there sometimes. It was another routine day. I was out on patrol, ensuring the trails were clear and safe for visitors. The park had its fair share of wildlife encounters, but those were usually black bears or moose creatures you could predict and manage. Today felt different, though. The air was thick with an odd tension, like the forest was holding its breath. My name's Travis Carrion, by the way. Born and raised in a small town in Montana, I've always had a knack for the outdoors. After a stint in the Marines, I figured park ranger was a good fit. It gave me purpose, a way to protect something beautiful and primal. Around midday, I met up with two colleagues, Daryl Shortridge and Linda Keeler, at the ranger station. Daryl, a big guy with a beard that made him look like he'd stepped out of the 19th century, was recounting his morning patrol. Linda, sharp-eyed and pragmatic, was logging the day's activities. "You notice anything odd today?" I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "Yeah, actually," Daryl said, scratching his chin. "Found some weird tracks up near Hidden Lake. Looked like a wolf, but much bigger." Linda looked up from her notes. "I saw something similar near Avalanche Lake, almost like something had been dragging a carcass." We decided to check it out together. The park had a reputation to maintain, and we couldn't afford any spooked tourists. Armed with radios and a couple of rifles, standard issue for potential bear encounters, we set off towards Hidden Lake. The hike was beautiful, as always. Majestic peaks loomed overhead, and the scent of pine was intoxicating. But the beauty masked an undercurrent of unease. It didn't take long to find the tracks Daryl mentioned. They were huge, almost a foot long, and they sank deep into the soft earth. "Definitely not a bear," Linda muttered, crouching to get a closer look. We followed the tracks further into the forest, away from the beaten path. The trees grew denser, the air colder, and the feeling of being watched crept over us, making every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves feel ominous. As we rounded a bend, the forest opened into a small clearing. And that's when we saw it. A deer carcass, mangled and partially devoured. The sight was gruesome, blood splattering the surrounding foliage. But it wasn't the carcass that made us freeze. It was what was standing over it. The creature was like nothing I'd ever seen. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, covered in dark matted fur. Its limbs were long and muscular, ending in claws that looked like they could rend steel. Its face was a grotesque blend of animal and something almost human, with a snout full of jagged teeth and eyes that gleamed with a malevolent intelligence. "Jesus Christ," Daryl breathed, his rifle already at the ready. Linda and I followed suit, raising our rifles, but none of us moved. The creature stared at us, unblinking, its breath coming out in visible puffs of steam. Then, without warning, it let out a bone-chilling shriek and charged. Everything became a blur. I fired my rifle, the recoil jolting me back. But the creature didn't stop. It barreled into Daryl, sending him flying into a tree with a sickening crunch. Linda and I kept firing, the sound of gunshots echoing through the forest. But the creature's speed was terrifying. It slashed at Linda, its claws tearing through her side, and she went down screaming. I kept backing up, trying to get a clear shot, but the creature was relentless. It lunged at me, and I felt its claws graze my arm as I dodged to the side. I managed to get one more shot off, hitting it in the leg. The creature stumbled, letting out another shriek, and then it turned and vanished into the forest, moving impossibly fast for something its size. I rushed to Linda's side. She was bleeding heavily but conscious. "Hang in there, Linda," I said, ripping off my jacket to press against her wound. Daryl was lying motionless against the tree. My heart sank as I checked for a pulse. Nothing. He was gone. I grabbed my radio, calling for backup and medical assistance. "This is Ranger Carrion. We've been attacked. Ranger Shortridge is dead. Ranger Keeler is injured. We need immediate assistance at Hidden Lake." The response was immediate. Hold tight, Travis. Help is on the way. The next few minutes felt like hours. I kept pressure on Linda's wound, trying to keep her talking, to stay conscious. You're going to be okay, Linda. Just hang on. What the hell was that thing, Travis? She gasped, her face pale. I don't know, I said honestly, but we're going to find out. The sound of approaching footsteps was a relief, and soon other rangers appeared, armed and ready. They took over tending to Linda, and I gave a quick rundown of what happened. Daryl's body was taken away, and Linda was rushed to the hospital. I stayed behind with a small team to track the creature, but it was as if it had vanished into thin air. The tracks led us deeper into the forest, but eventually they just stopped. It was unnerving, to say the least. Back at the ranger station, I sat down with the park superintendent, Michael Dunham, and recounted the entire encounter. We need to close off that section of the park, I urged. Whatever that thing is, it's dangerous. Dunham nodded grimly. Agreed. I'll inform the authorities. This is going to cause a media frenzy. In the days that followed, the park was partially closed, and an official investigation was launched. Experts came in, but no one could identify the creature from our descriptions. The media dubbed it the Glacier Beast, and speculation ran wild. Cryptozoologists, thrill seekers, and conspiracy theorists descended on the area, but no one could find any definitive proof. Linda recovered, but she was left with a deep scar on her side and a haunted look in her eyes. Daryl's death hit us all hard. He was a good man, a good ranger, and his loss was a heavy blow. As for me, I kept patrolling, kept looking for signs of the creature. Some nights when the forest was particularly quiet, I'd feel that same tension in the air, that sense of being watched. But the creature never showed itself again. Life in the park returned to a semblance of normalcy, but we were all changed by that day. The Glacier Beast remained a mystery, a dark presence in the back of our minds. We continued our work protecting the park and its visitors, but with a new awareness of the unknown dangers that lurked in the wild. And that's the end of it. The official reports labeled it an animal attack, but we knew better. There are things out there that defy explanation, creatures that don't fit into the neat categories of science. We encountered one of them, and it left its mark on us, a reminder that the wilderness still holds secrets, some of them terrifying, some of them deadly. They say people who live out here like I do choose solitude over sanity. Maybe they're right, but I didn't have many other options after my wife left me. No warning, just a note on the fridge. I figured my time in the city was done. Sold what little I had left, bought an old trailer, and found myself a patch of land far enough away from civilization that I wouldn't have to see another person unless I wanted to. Not that I ever wanted to. This was 2010, a year that still makes me laugh because it was supposed to be the start of something better. That's what my ex-wife used to say. The name's Garrett Durst. It's not a name that gets tossed around in polite circles, but I'm not a man of polite circles anymore. Haven't been for years. Most of my days are spent working on the trailer, fixing leaks, making the place habitable, if you could call it that. If it wasn't for the occasional hunting trip or hike through the woods, I'd probably go mad. I've got some dark humor to keep me company. I guess you could call that a coping mechanism. Why don't ghosts haunt the forest? Because all the spirits get axed before they get too close. Yeah, it's lame, but it keeps me entertained. My land sits somewhere near the Idaho-Montana border, far from any real town or road. It's the kind of place that doesn't even show up on GPS, so I don't worry about company. No phone signal, no electricity, just me, the woods, and whatever decides to wander through. A few hunters pass by now and then, but mostly it's quiet. Until it wasn't. I was in the middle of replacing some rotting wood on the trailer siding when I noticed it, the eerie quiet. The birds that usually sang all day were gone. No rustling leaves or snapping twigs from squirrels or deer. It was just silence, like someone hit a mute button on the world. I remember thinking, well, maybe nature finally decided to give me a break. But that thought was cut short when I heard the first scream. It was distant, probably a mile or so out, but it wasn't an animal sound. No, this was a person, high-pitched, panicked. I dropped my hammer, my mind racing through every reason why someone would be screaming that far out. We don't get hikers out here. At least none that survived long enough to scream like that. I grabbed my shotgun. I don't usually carry it around with me. Hadn't needed to in years. But something about that scream put a pit in my stomach. You know, the kind that only shows up when you know something's wrong. I stuffed a few extra shells into my pockets and headed out into the woods. It was easy to follow the sound. It didn't stop. The trees were dense, but I know this land like the back of my hand. It's my backyard, after all. About 15 minutes into my walk, I found the source. 2 men, or at least what was left of them. They were torn apart, bodies strewn across the clearing like rag dolls, blood pooling into the grass. One of them was missing half his face, his jaw hanging on by a thread. The other, well, there wasn't much left to describe. I'm no stranger to hunting accidents, but this wasn't something a bear or mountain lion could do. No, this was deliberate, violent, like whatever did this wanted to make a point, and it didn't take long for me to figure out that it was still nearby. I heard it before I saw it, heavy footsteps, the kind that make the earth tremble a little. I turned slowly, my shotgun raised, ready for whatever was coming. But nothing could have prepared me for what stepped out of the trees. It was big, probably about 7 feet tall, with long, matted fur that clung to its body in clumps. The thing looked like a cross between a man and a wolf, but worse, much worse. It stood on 2 legs but hunched, its long arms ending in claws that were caked in dried blood. And its teeth. God, the teeth. It didn't snarl or roar, just stood there breathing heavy, watching me. I fired off a shot. It hit, but it didn't stop the thing. It staggered back, more out of surprise than pain, before it charged. I barely had time to pump another shell before it was on me. I managed to duck just as one of those claws swiped where my head had been. I hit the ground hard but scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't look back, didn't want to see how close it was. I could hear it, though, crashing through the trees behind me, getting closer. I made it back to the trailer and slammed the door shut, locking it, as if that would stop something like that. I could hear it outside, circling, testing the windows, the door. It let out a low sound, not a roar or a growl, just this deep, guttural noise that vibrated through the walls. I reloaded the shotgun, my hand shaking. I wasn't sure if it was fear or adrenaline, but I wasn't about to sit around and find out. The thing slammed into the side of the trailer, the entire structure rocking from the force. It didn't care about the door. It was going to rip its way inside, one way or another. I had one shot, maybe two if I was lucky. So I waited, my back pressed against the far wall, shotgun aimed at the door. It hit again, harder this time. The door buckled, hinges groaning under the pressure. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and then it happened. The door flew off its hinges, crashing into the opposite wall. The creature stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the fading light outside. It stepped in, its massive frame barely fitting through the door frame. I didn't wait. I pulled the trigger. The blast hit it square in the chest, and for a moment, I thought I had it. But it didn't go down. It stumbled, blood oozing from the wound. But it didn't fall. It looked at me, more annoyed than anything, and I realized I was out of options. That's when I heard the second scream. It wasn't from outside. It was from inside the trailer, somewhere in the back. My heart sank. I wasn't alone in here. I backed up, my shotgun empty, nowhere to run. The creature took a step forward, and then it stopped, its head snapping toward the back room. I heard the scream again, louder this time, closer, and then something else, something I'll never forget. A second one. There was a second one of those things, but smaller, faster. It darted out from the shadows, slamming into the larger creature. They tumbled together, clawing, biting, tearing into each other. I didn't stick around to watch the rest. I ran. I made it outside, not stopping until I hit the tree line. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I stopped, my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like jelly. I collapsed against a tree, listening. I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own breathing, but I wasn't about to take any chances. When I finally made it back to the trailer, the place was trashed. The creatures were gone, but the damage they left behind wasn't something I could ignore. Blood, fur, and claw marks covered every surface. The door was gone, windows shattered, walls torn open like paper. But it wasn't just the destruction that bothered me. It was the bodies, those two men I found earlier. They weren't there anymore. Something had taken them. Something had dragged them off into the woods. I don't know what those things were, but I know they're still out there somewhere. In those woods. I can hear them sometimes at night. Not close, but not far enough away to feel safe. I've thought about leaving, packing up and finding somewhere else to hide. But where do you go when the monsters already know where you live? So I stay. I've reinforced the trailer, made it as secure as I can. I keep the shotgun loaded, shells within reach at all times. I've started sleeping during the day, keeping watch at night. I haven't seen them again, but I know they're out there, waiting. I can feel it, and I'll be ready when they come. You wouldn't believe the stuff I've seen working for the missing persons unit in Chicago. It's not exactly the glamorous, action-packed job you see on TV, but every so often a case comes along that sticks with you. My name's Dalton Sfer, and I've been with the unit for about 15 years. This story, though, this one day, it's the kind of thing that makes you question everything. I had just walked into the office, still shaking off the cold of an early Chicago morning. The city was waking up, the streets bustling with people hurrying to their destinations, unaware of the strange and dark corners lurking just out of sight. I grabbed my coffee, black and strong, and sat down at my desk. The stack of case files waiting for me was higher than usual, which wasn't a good sign. "Morning, Sver," came the familiar voice of Hank Kowalski, my partner. He was a gruff guy, ex-military, with a no-nonsense attitude and a surprisingly dry sense of humor. We had been through a lot together, but nothing like what we were about to face. "Morning, Hank. What's the news?" I asked, skimming through the first file. "We got a call last night. Couple of hikers went missing in the woods near Willow Creek. Sheriff says it looks strange, even for a missing persons case." "Strange how?" Hank shrugged. "Just said he had a bad feeling about it. Figured we should take a look." Bad feelings weren't exactly uncommon in our line of work, but something about Hank's tone made me pay attention. I put down my coffee and grabbed my jacket. "All right, let's go." Willow Creek was a couple of hours out of the city, a small, sleepy town that didn't see much excitement. The drive was uneventful, filled with the usual small talk and speculation about the case. As we pulled into town, the sheriff's office came into view. Sheriff Lonnie Barrett was waiting for us outside, his weathered face lined with worry. "Thanks for coming, fellas," he greeted us, shaking our hands. "I'm telling you, something's not right about this." "Tell us what you know," I said. He led us inside and laid out the details. 2 hikers, a young couple named Danny and Lisa, had set out yesterday morning for a day hike. When they didn't return by nightfall, their friends reported them missing. The sheriff's men had searched the area but found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing. "We've had folks get lost before," Barrett said, "but never like this. It's like they just vanished." Hank and I exchanged a glance. We dealt with plenty of disappearances, but complete vanishings were rare and unsettling. We decided to start our search where the couple had last been seen, a trailhead at the edge of the forest. The woods were dense, the kind of place where it was easy to lose your bearings. We split up, Hank heading north while I went south. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. Hours passed with no sign of Danny or Lisa. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I came across something odd. A clearing, not marked on any of the maps we had seen, with a single ancient-looking tree standing in the center. It was gnarled and twisted, unlike any other tree in the forest. Carved into its bark were strange symbols, unlike anything I'd ever seen. I called Hank on the radio. "You need to see this." He arrived a few minutes later, eyes narrowing at the sight. "What the hell is this?" "No idea, but it feels wrong." We decided to set up camp for the night, keeping the tree in our sights. As darkness fell, an uneasy silence settled over the woods. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, we heard it, a low, guttural sound, not quite human, but not entirely animal either. It echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. Hank and I exchanged a look, both of us reaching for our guns. "Stay close," he whispered. We moved towards the sound, the darkness pressing in around us. The noise grew louder, more insistent. And then we saw it. A figure, hunched and twisted, moving between the trees with unnatural speed. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, part man, part beast. with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. "Holy," Hank breathed. The creature turned towards us, and for a moment, everything went still. Then it charged. We fired, but the bullets seemed to do little more than slow it down. It was on us in seconds, a blur of claws and teeth. I went down hard, my head slamming into the ground, and the world went black. When I came to, the creature was gone, and Hank was leaning over me, a nasty gash on his arm. "You all right?" "Yeah," I groaned, sitting up. "What the hell was that?" "No idea, but we need to find those kids and get out of here." We followed the trail of destruction left by the creature, hoping it would lead us to Danny and Lisa. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trees whispering secrets we couldn't understand. Then we found them, or what was left of them. Their bodies were torn apart, barely recognizable. It was a gruesome sight, one that would haunt me for a long time. But there was something else, something even more disturbing. The strange symbols from the tree were carved into their skin, as if the creature had marked them. "We need to get out of here," Hank said, his voice shaking now. We made our way back to the clearing, the ancient tree looming over us. It felt like it was watching, judging. We didn't waste any time packing up and heading back to the trailhead. The drive back to the city was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. We reported everything to the sheriff, who looked as shaken as we felt. There wasn't much he could do. The creature was gone, and the town would have to deal with the aftermath. As for us, we had other cases to handle, other mysteries to solve. But that day in Willow Creek, it stayed with me. It was a reminder that there are things out there lurking in the shadows, waiting for their moment. And sometimes we're the ones who have to face them. Back in the office, I sat down at my desk, the familiar routine a small comfort. Hank walked over, his arm bandaged, but otherwise looking no worse for wear. "Hell of a day, huh?" he said. "Yeah," I replied, taking a sip of my now cold coffee. The city outside bustled with life, oblivious to the horrors that lurked just beyond its borders. But I knew better. I knew that the world was full of dark corners and hidden creatures, and that sometimes the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary was thinner than we thought. Sometimes, even the most mundane days begin with the slightest hint of something off, something that just doesn't sit right. It was a typical morning when I walked into the office of the Missing Persons Unit in Phoenix, Arizona. The desert heat was already baking the streets outside, and I was nursing my third cup of coffee before even starting my shift. I've been at this job for 10 years now, and I've seen it all. Or so I thought. I'm Louis Kincaid, a senior investigator with the MPU. We specialize in cases that have gone cold or those that have been dismissed as unsolvable. Our office was a small, cluttered space, filled with maps, case files, and the scent of desperation and coffee. My boss, Chief Nathaniel Porter, was an old-school cop with a gruff demeanor but a heart of gold hidden under layers of cynicism. On this particular day, we received a call from a frantic woman named Marissa Diaz. Her brother, Raphael, had gone missing 2 days ago. Raphael was a seasoned hiker and outdoor enthusiast, and his disappearance in the rugged terrain of the Superstition Mountains didn't fit the profile of someone who'd simply gotten lost. Marissa was convinced something more sinister was at play. She mentioned that Raphael had been investigating strange occurrences in the area, reports of mutilated wildlife and eerie, guttural sounds at night. Given the nature of our work, this piqued my interest more than I'd like to admit. The Superstition Mountains have always had their share of legends and folklore, but it seemed like there was something tangible behind Raphael's disappearance. I grabbed my gear and briefed my partner, Malik Taylor, a sharp-eyed former Marine with a knack for tracking. We decided to head out immediately. Marissa provided us with Raphael's last known coordinates and the details of his planned route. As we drove towards the mountains, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case was going to be different. The Superstitions were notorious for their treacherous terrain and sudden weather changes. By the time we arrived, the sun was high, casting long shadows over the jagged rocks and sparse vegetation. We parked at the trailhead and began our hike, following Raphael's trail markers. The first few hours were uneventful. Malik and I made small talk, mostly about the usual office politics and the absurdity of some of our cases. But as we ventured deeper, the atmosphere changed. The air felt heavier. The silence of the desert, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a hawk. We reached Raphael's last known location by late afternoon. It was a small clearing surrounded by large boulders and thick brush. The area looked undisturbed at first glance, but Malik's sharp eyes caught something, a backpack partially hidden behind a rock. It was Raphael's, and it had been torn open, its contents scattered. We began searching the area more thoroughly. That's when we found the first sign of trouble, a trail of blood leading away from the clearing. It wasn't a lot, but enough to indicate that someone had been injured. My heart rate quickened as we followed the trail. The blood trail led us to a small cave entrance, barely visible among the rocks. It was dark and foreboding, but we had no choice. We drew our flashlights and stepped inside, our senses heightened by the oppressive silence and the faint metallic scent of blood. The cave was narrow and winding, forcing us to move in single file. Malik took the lead, his military training evident in his cautious movements. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A makeshift camp with signs of a struggle. There were scratch marks on the walls and, more disturbingly, patches of fur and blood. What the hell happened here? Malik muttered, scanning the area with his flashlight. I don't know, but it's not good, I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the confined space. As we moved deeper into the cave, the atmosphere grew colder, and the air was thick with an unidentifiable stench. Suddenly, Malik stopped short, his flashlight fixed on something ahead. I followed his gaze and saw it. A body, or what was left of it. It was Raphael. His body was mangled, as if mauled by a wild animal. But there was something off. The wounds were too precise, too deliberate. And there, standing over the body, was the creature. An unknown animalistic being, hunched and grotesque, its eyes glinting in the flashlight's beam. Before we could react, the creature lunged at Malik with terrifying speed. He fired his weapon, but it barely slowed the creature down. It was on him in an instant, its claws slashing through his jacket and drawing blood. I aimed my flashlight and gun, trying to get a clear shot, but the cave's narrow confines made it difficult. "Get out of here, Lewis," Malik shouted, struggling against the creature's relentless assault. but I couldn't leave him. I fired my gun, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet hit the creature, causing it to screech and retreat momentarily. I seized the opportunity to grab Malik and pull him away. We stumbled out of the cave, the creature's roars echoing behind us. I half-carried, half-dragged Malik until we were a safe distance away. His wounds were deep, but he was still conscious. "Lewis, we need to call for backup," he gasped, wincing in pain. I nodded, fumbling for my radio. "This is Concade. We need immediate assistance at the Superstition Mountains. Officer down. Repeat, officer down." As we waited for help to arrive, I kept a wary eye on the cave entrance. The creature didn't emerge, but I knew it was still in there, waiting. When the backup arrived, we evacuated Malik and secured the area. The following days were a blur of reports, investigations, and sleepless nights. Malik recovered from his injuries, but the memory of that creature haunted us both. The official report listed Raphael's death as a wild animal attack, but we knew the truth was far more sinister. The cave was sealed off, and the area was declared off-limits to the public. The higher-ups didn't want to cause a panic, and there was no way to explain what we had seen. But Malik and I knew that something was out there, something beyond our understanding, and so life went on. Cases came and went, but the memory of that day in the Superstition Mountains stayed with me. I don't talk about it much, and neither does Malik. It's just one of those things you carry with you, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. My name is Tommy, and this happened to me on October 15th, 2008. I'm a search and rescue officer in the thick woods of northern Idaho. I've spent most of my adult life here, navigating the dense forests and towering pines, looking for lost hikers and the occasional missing camper. I'm good at my job, and I like to think I've seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that autumn day. It started like any other search operation. Early in the morning, I got a call about a missing girl, Marissa Anders, 12 years old, lost in the woods near Priest Lake. She had wandered off from a family camping trip and hadn't been seen for over 12 hours. This wasn't unusual. Kids get lost all the time. The trick is finding them before nightfall, when the temperature drops and the dangers of the forest become all too real. I met up with my partner Dale Morgan at the trailhead. Dale's been doing this almost as long as I have. He's a tough guy, ex-military, no nonsense. We exchanged a few jokes about how we'd probably find the girl within a couple of hours. Maybe scolded but safe, hiding in a hollow tree or something. We gathered our gear, checked our radios, and set off into the woods. The air was crisp and cool, with the scent of pine needles filling our lungs. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and squirrels chattering. The initial search was uneventful. We called out Marissa's name, paused to listen, then moved on. We followed the main trail for a couple of miles before veering off into the underbrush where her parents last saw her. Hours passed without any sign of her. No footprints, no discarded items. Nothing. Dale started to get a bit uneasy, which was unusual for him. Around midday, we met up with another team to regroup and share updates. No one had found anything. It was like the girl had vanished into thin air. As the sun began to sink lower, we decided to split up and cover more ground before it got dark. I headed north, deeper into the forest. while Dale and the others fanned out in different directions. I trudged through the thick undergrowth, the sound of crunching leaves and snapping twigs my only company. The forest felt different somehow, quieter than usual. I paused to catch my breath and noticed a faint trail I hadn't seen before, leading further into the woods. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, overgrown and almost invisible. Figuring it was worth a shot, I followed it. After about an hour, I came across an old cabin. It was barely standing, more of a ruin than a shelter. The roof was caved in, and the wooden walls were covered in moss and ivy. I didn't expect to find Marissa here, but the place seemed worth a quick look. Maybe she'd taken shelter inside. I stepped through the creaky doorway and immediately felt a chill. The air was damp and musty, filled with the scent of decay. The cabin was empty except for a few rusted tools and a broken table. I called out Marissa's name, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange on the floor, a small, faded backpack. It was pink, with cartoon characters on it, clearly a child's. My heart started to race. I picked up the backpack and rummaged through it. Inside were a few snacks, a water bottle, and a map of the campsite with a name written on it. Marissa. This was definitely her backpack. I radioed Dale to let him know what I'd found and asked him to come over. While waiting for Dale, I decided to look around outside. The forest was growing darker, and the shadows seemed to stretch out like grasping hands. I found a narrow path behind the cabin, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. It looked like it led further into the forest, away from any marked trails. I followed it, flashlight in hand, calling out Marissa's name every few steps. About 20 minutes in, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. It was a large clearing, and in the center stood a tall, grotesque statue. It was made of twisted branches and bones, fashioned into the rough shape of a man. At its base was a pile of clothes, all children's sizes. My flashlight beam flickered over the scene, and I felt a deep, primal fear settle in my gut. I turned to head back to the cabin, but stopped short. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure, tall, thin, almost skeletal. It was hard to make out any details in the fading light, but I could feel its eyes on me. I shouted at it, demanding to know who it was, but it didn't respond. Instead, it took a step forward, then another, moving with an unnatural, jerky gait. I backed away, my hand instinctively reaching for the gun at my hip. I'm not usually armed on these searches, but something about this place, this situation, made me glad I'd broken that rule today. The figure kept coming, and I could see it more clearly now. Its face was pale and twisted, like something out of a nightmare. It had no eyes, just dark, empty sockets. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare it off, but it didn't flinch. It kept advancing, slow but relentless. I aimed and fired again, this time hitting it square in the chest. It staggered but didn't fall. I fired again and again, each shot echoing through the trees. Finally, it collapsed, falling to the ground in a heap. I stood there, breathing hard, my ears ringing from the gunshots. The figure lay still, but I wasn't taking any chances. I approached cautiously, my flashlight trained on its body. Up close, it looked even worse. The skin was pale and leathery, stretched tight over sharp bones. It wore tattered, blood-stained clothes that looked like they'd been ripped from different victims. As I stood over it, Dale's voice crackled through my radio, asking where I was. I gave him my coordinates and told him to hurry. While waiting, I examined the clearing more closely. Among the clothes at the statue's base, I found a small shoe, pink with a sparkly bow. It matched the description of what Marissa had been wearing. When Dale arrived, I showed him the scene. He didn't say much, just nodded grimly. We both knew this wasn't something we could easily explain. We gathered what evidence we could, including Marissa's backpack and the shoe, and headed back to the cabin. We radioed the rest of the team and informed them of the situation. A search party was organized to comb the area around the clearing, but no other bodies or clues were found. It was like the forest had swallowed everything else whole. We reported our findings to the authorities, who launched a full investigation. The cabin, the clearing, and the grotesque statue became the focus. They identified the figure as some kind of deranged hermit who'd been living in the woods for years, preying on lost hikers and campers. They found more evidence of his victims scattered around his makeshift home, but Marissa was never found. The case made headlines for a while, and people stopped visiting Priest Lake for a time. The forest seemed tainted by what had happened, and it took years for the area to recover. I still think about Marissa, about all those kids whose lives ended in those woods. I've been on countless search and rescue missions since, but nothing has ever come close to that day. I keep her backpack in my truck, a reminder of the ones we couldn't save. And sometimes, when I'm out in the forest alone, I swear I can feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. My name is Carlos, and this happened to me on August 13, 2008. I was working as a search and rescue officer in the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. I'd been on the job for over a decade, and I had seen my fair share of strange things, but nothing prepared me for what happened that summer. It was a typical humid day when we got the call about a missing person. A hiker named Ralph Wade had been reported missing by his wife after he didn't return from a solo trek. Solo hikers often get themselves into trouble, but Ralph was an experienced outdoorsman. This was unusual. I teamed up with my colleague, Mike Sanford. Mike was a sturdy guy, reliable and thorough. We grabbed our packs, checked our radios, and set out. The forest was thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth, and the cicadas were loud enough to drive you mad. We started on the trail Ralph's wife said he was taking. "You ever been out this far, Mike?" he asked, pushing a branch out of his way. "Once or twice," I replied, "but it's easy to get turned around if you're not careful." We walked for hours, calling Ralph's name, stopping every now and then to listen for any response. The only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the rustling of leaves. It was eerie, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. Just as the sun began to dip, we found Ralph's camp. His tent was pitched near a small clearing, his backpack leaning against a tree. But there was no sign of him. "Something's not right," Mike muttered, poking around the campsite. Why would he leave his stuff? We radioed back to base, letting them know we found the campsite but not Ralph. They told us to set up camp and continue the search in the morning. Nightfall in the forest can be disorienting, and it wasn't safe to wander in the dark. We built a fire and settled in. The crackling flames were comforting, but the surrounding darkness felt oppressive. Mike tried to lighten the mood with stories about past rescues, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, a sound broke the stillness, a low, guttural noise, unlike any animal I'd ever heard. Mike and I exchanged glances. "You hear that?" he whispered. "Yeah," I nodded. "Stay close to the fire." We listened, the noise growing closer. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. We spent the rest of the night on high alert, but nothing else happened. At dawn, we resumed our search. We followed a faint trail leading deeper into the forest, hoping it would lead us to Ralph. About a mile in, we found a shoe. It was Ralph's, no doubt about it, but it was torn and bloodied, as if something had ripped it off his foot. "This doesn't look good," Mike said, his voice grim. We pressed on, more cautious now. The trail led us to a rocky outcrop with a small cave entrance. I don't know why, but something about that cave made my stomach turn. "We should check it out," Mike said, already moving towards it. Inside the cave it was cold and damp. The smell of decay hit us like a punch. We found Ralph, or what was left of him. His body was mangled, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. It was a gruesome sight, and it took all my willpower not to be sick. "What the hell did this?" Mike's voice was shaky, and I could tell he was just as shaken as I was. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to get back and report this." As we turned to leave, I saw movement in the shadows. A figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. It stood there, watching us. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted out of the cave. We ran through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, the sound of heavy footsteps behind us. Whatever it was fast. We burst into the clearing where our camp was, and the footsteps stopped. We didn't look back, just kept running until we reached the trailhead. Back at base, we reported what we found. The higher-ups dismissed our account of the creature, chalking it up to stress and shock. They organized a recovery team to retrieve Ralph's body, but Mike and I were not part of it. We were ordered to take a few days off to recover. I couldn't get the image of that creature out of my head, the way it moved, the way it watched us. It was something primal, something that didn't belong in our world. Mike and I didn't talk about it much after that. We both knew no one would believe us. Ralph's death was officially listed as an animal attack. "The forest has its dangers," they said, "but I know what I saw. It wasn't an animal, and I don't think Ralph was the first or the last to encounter whatever that was." Years have passed since that day, but the memory is still vivid. Sometimes I think about going back, trying to find answers, but then I remember those eyes, and I decide it's better to leave some things alone. Life goes on, but the forest holds its secrets, and some of those secrets are better left undisturbed. It was August 19th, 2010. I was a truck driver, hauling freight across the less glamorous parts of the country. This one time I was hauling a load of frozen goods from Cincinnati down to a small town called McGregor in Texas. It was a long, uneventful route for the most part, but things took a turn that made this trip unforgettable. I was a couple of hours out of Memphis when I got a call from my dispatcher, Frank. Frank was a no-nonsense kind of guy, the sort who'd seen it all and dealt with worse. He told me there'd been a change in my drop-off schedule. Apparently the warehouse in McGregor couldn't take the delivery until the following morning, so I'd have to find somewhere to park overnight. Now, finding a good spot to park a rig overnight isn't always easy. Truck stops fill up fast, and not every town is welcoming to a big semi parked down the street. I pulled out my map old school style and found a small truck stop listed a few miles off the interstate in a place called Junction City. Sounded like as good a place as any to kill some time. I pulled into the truck stop around dusk. It was one of those rundown places you see all over the country. More asphalt and dust than anything else. The sign flickered, half the letters burned out. There were only a couple of other trucks parked, and the diner looked like it hadn't seen a good cleaning in years. But they had showers, and I could get a meal, so I figured I'd make do. I parked my rig and headed into the diner. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee and greasy food. The waitress was friendly enough, and the coffee was hot. I ordered a burger and fries and struck up a conversation with a guy named Hank sitting at the counter. Hank was a local, just there for a meal after a day of working on his farm. We talked about the weather, crops, and how the town had seen better days. After dinner, I grabbed a shower, feeling the grime of the road wash away. As I was heading back to my truck, I noticed another rig had pulled in, a beat-up old Peterbilt. Something about it seemed off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The driver wasn't around, and I didn't think much of it. I settled into my cab, locked the doors, and got ready to sleep. Truckers develop a sixth sense for safety, and while Junction City wasn't the worst place I'd been, I still took my precautions. It must have been around midnight when I woke up. It was one of those wake-ups where you're not sure what pulled you out of sleep. I glanced around the cab, dimly lit by the glow of the truck stop lights. That's when I heard a noise, a soft scraping sound coming from outside. I thought maybe it was just an animal, but it didn't sit right with me. I peered out the window and saw a shadow moving near the other rig, the old Peterbilt. I rubbed my eyes, trying to get a better look. The shadow moved again, and I saw a figure crouched by the truck, fiddling with something near the back. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly opened my door. Something about the way the figure moved made me uneasy. As I got closer, I realized the person was messing with the trailer's lock. "Hey, what are you doing?" I called out. The figure froze, then bolted around the side of the truck and disappeared into the darkness. I shone my flashlight where the person had been and saw the lock on the trailer had been cut. I didn't know what was in the trailer, but it didn't matter. Theft was common, but this felt more malicious. I went back to my truck, grabbed my phone, and called the local sheriff's office. The dispatcher said they'd send someone out, but being a small town, it might take a while. I wasn't about to just sit there and wait, so I decided to stay up and keep an eye on things. I kept thinking about that shadowy figure and the way they moved. It didn't seem like your run-of-the-mill thief. There was something more deliberate about it, like they were looking for something specific. It was around 1:30 in the morning when I saw headlights coming down the road. A dusty old sedan pulled into the lot, and a tall man in a sheriff's uniform got out. He looked tired, like he'd rather be anywhere else but here. He introduced himself as Sheriff Donnelly and asked me what I'd seen. I told him about the figure and the cut lock. He nodded, looking around the lot with a flashlight. "We've had a few reports of break-ins around here," he said. "Nothing too serious, but I'll take a look." We walked over to the Peterbilt, and Sheriff Donnelly examined the lock. He muttered something under his breath, then walked around the truck, shining his light into the shadows. "You didn't see where they went?" he asked. "No," I replied. just took off into the dark. He nodded again, then stood there for a moment thinking, "Well, I'll patrol the area, see if I can find anything. You stay put, and if you see anything else, give us a call." I thanked him, and he drove off, his headlights disappearing into the night. I felt a bit more at ease knowing the sheriff was around, but something still gnawed at me. I climbed back into my truck and locked the doors again. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. I kept replaying the scene, trying to make sense of it. Around 3 a.m., I heard another noise, louder this time. It sounded like metal scraping against metal. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window. The figure was back, this time at my trailer. I cursed under my breath and grabbed my phone to call the sheriff again. As I dialed, the figure must have heard me. They turned and looked straight at my cab. For a split second, we locked eyes. I couldn't make out their face, but the intensity of their stare sent a chill down my spine. The figure took off running again, disappearing behind the trailers. I jumped out of my truck and ran after them, not thinking clearly. I just wanted to catch whoever was causing this trouble. I rounded the corner of the trailer and saw the figure heading towards the tree line at the edge of the lot. "Stop!" I yelled, but they kept running. Just then a shot rang out. I ducked instinctively, heart racing. I looked around, trying to figure out where it came from. Another shot followed, and I saw the figure collapse near the trees. Sheriff Donnelly emerged from the darkness, his gun drawn. He approached the figure cautiously, then signaled for me to come over. I walked up, my flashlight illuminating the scene. The figure lay on the ground, groaning in pain. The sheriff kicked away a small knife that had fallen from their hand. "Stay back," he ordered, and I did as I was told. The sheriff knelt down and checked the person's pulse. "He's alive," he said, then called for an ambulance on his radio. He looked up at me. "You okay?" "Yeah," I replied, still shaking, just startled. The paramedics arrived a few minutes later and took the figure away. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, I caught a glimpse of his face. He was young, maybe in his early 20s, with wild eyes and a gaunt face. Something about him looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. The sheriff took my statement, and I spent the rest of the night in my truck, unable to sleep. Morning came, and I headed to the warehouse in McGregor, delivering my load without further incident. But the events of that night stayed with me. A few days later, I got a call from Sheriff Donnelly. He told me the man they'd arrested was part of a small-time gang that had been targeting truck stops and rest areas along the interstate. They'd been stealing cargo and selling it off. But the guy they'd caught that night had a different motive. He was looking for a specific shipment, a shipment he believed contained something valuable. The sheriff didn't go into details, but he mentioned that the guy had been in and out of trouble for years, always looking for a big score. That night, he was desperate, and desperation makes people dangerous. I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes staring at me in the dark. It was a reminder that even in the most mundane places, danger could lurk. I took more precautions after that, always staying alert, always watching my surroundings. Truck driving is a lonely job, but it's moments like these that make you realize how vulnerable you really are out there on the open road. I still drive through Junction City from time to time, and every time I pass that old truck stop, I think about that night. It's a reminder to never let your guard down, because you never know what's waiting for you in the dark. My name is Ryan, and this happened to me on October 15th, 2009. I've been a truck driver for the past 18 years, hauling goods across the country. You get used to the loneliness, the long stretches of road, the truck stops that all start to look the same. But what happened that night in Montana still haunts me. And not just because I lost a friend. It started like any other haul. I was driving west on Route 2, a lonely stretch of highway cutting through the plains and mountains. My partner, Travis Callahan, rode shotgun. We'd been doing runs together for about a year, and we'd developed a rhythm. He was a funny guy, always quick with a joke or a story from his wilder days. We were hauling a load of lumber from Minnesota to Seattle. A good 3-day trip if we took turns driving. The first couple of days went smoothly. We stopped in small towns, grabbed coffee at dingy diners, and swapped stories with other truckers. By the third night, we were deep into Montana, near a place called Glasgow. It was late, around midnight, when we decided to pull over at a rest area to stretch our legs and take a leak. The rest area was one of those old, run-down places, a couple of rusty picnic tables and a single bathroom that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. Travis and I got out, and the cold hit us. October nights in Montana can be brutal. We were the only ones there, which wasn't unusual. Most truckers preferred the more modern stops closer to the interstates. We were standing there, looking up at the stars, when we heard it, a faint, muffled scream coming from somewhere in the woods behind the rest area. I glanced at Travis, and he raised an eyebrow. "You hear that?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Sounds like someone's in trouble." Travis, always the curious one, said, "Let's check it out. Might be someone who needs help." I wasn't thrilled about the idea. Man, it's probably just some kids messing around. But Travis was already heading towards the trees, so I followed him. We walked into the woods, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The screaming got louder, more desperate. My gut told me to turn back, but Travis kept pushing forward. About 50 yards in, we found her. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, tied to a tree with duct tape over her mouth. She looked terrified, her eyes wide with fear. Travis rushed over and started to untie her while I kept an eye out for whoever did this. "Who did this to you?" Travis asked, pulling the tape off her mouth. She started to speak, but before she could get a word out, a figure emerged from the darkness. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing and holding a knife. No words, just the glint of the blade in the moonlight. "Travis, watch out," I shouted. But it was too late. The guy lunged at Travis, stabbing him in the side. Travis went down, clutching his wound. The woman screamed, and the guy turned his attention to her. I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at him, catching him across the back. He grunted and turned on me, slashing wildly with the knife. I managed to dodge most of his attacks, but he was relentless. He got me on the arm, a deep gash that bled like crazy. I swung the branch again, hitting him square in the jaw. He stumbled back, and I took my chance. I grabbed Travis by the arm and dragged him away, the woman following close behind. We made it back to the truck, and I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911. The operator said it would take at least 30 minutes for the nearest police to arrive. Travis was losing a lot of blood, and I did my best to stop the bleeding with a rag from the truck. The woman was crying, her hands shaking as she told us her name was Emily, and that she had been hitchhiking when the man grabbed her. We waited, the three of us huddled in the cab of the truck, eyes darting to the tree line. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set our nerves on edge. Finally, the flashing lights of a police cruiser cut through the darkness. Two officers approached, guns drawn. They took our statements and searched the woods, but the man was gone, vanished like a ghost. Travis was rushed to the hospital. He survived, but the wound ended his trucking career. Emily gave her statement to the police, but they never found her abductor. It was like he disappeared into thin air. The cops said he was probably a drifter, someone who moved from place to place, never staying long enough to get caught. I still drive that route sometimes, and every time I pass that rest area, I think about that night. I think about Travis and how close we came to dying. I think about Emily and how she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think about that man, still out there somewhere, waiting for his next victim. It's funny, you know. You spend your whole life on the road, thinking you've seen it all. But then something like this happens, and you realize just how much you don't know, how much you can't control. The open road isn't as free as it seems. It's a place where anything can happen, where danger can be hiding around any corner. Travis and I drifted apart after that. He moved back to Texas, found a job managing a warehouse. We talk sometimes, but it's not the same. That night changed us, made us different people. I still drive, still haul loads across the country, but I'm always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if I'll see that man again. Life goes on though. You have to keep moving, keep driving. But some nights, when the road is quiet and the stars are out, I hear that scream, and I see those eyes, wide with fear, and I remember that we're all just a breath away from the darkness.